Well, before dawn on Friday, Meg was already out of town and traveling down 184. Nan had called the night before from her sister to let him know that they had made it safe and sound, and he didn't expect to get another call until at least Sunday. By the time he would probably be on his way back if he wasn't home already. He forwarded the house phone to his cell just in case. Not that he would have any reception once he was into the reserve. He retraced the same path they had taken 3.5 years before, with a few minor changes, not as many putty breaks, and he sailed by Multnomah Falls without looking. He had pushed away any doubts of the place since Mish's disappearance, sequestering his emotions securely in the padlocked basement of his own heart. On the long stretch of the George, Mac felt a creeping panic begin to penetrate his consciousness. He had tried to avoid thinking about what he was doing and just keep putting one foot in front of the other, but like Grace, pushing through concrete, the repressed feelings and fears somehow began to poke through. His eyes darkened and his hands tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the temptation at every up-ramp to turn around and go home. He knew he was driving straight into the center of his pain, the vortex of the great sadness that had so diminished his sense of being alive. Flashes of visual memory and stabbing instants of blistering fury now came in waves, attended by the taste of bile and blood in his mouth. He finally reached La Grande, where he grazed up and then took Highway 82 out to Joseph. He was half tempted to stop and look in on Tommy, but decided against it. The fewer people who thought he was raving lunatic, the better. Instead, he topped off his tank and headed out. Traffic was light and the Inaha and smaller roads were remarkably clear and dry for this time of year, much warmer than he had expected. But it seemed that the farther he drove, the slower he traveled, as if the shack were somehow repelling his approach. The jeep crossed the snow line as he climbed the last couple of miles to the trail that would take him down to the shack. Above the whine of the engine, he could hear the tires crunch doggedly through the deepening snow and ice. Even after a couple of wrong turns and some backtracking, it was only early afternoon when Mac finally pulled over and parked at the very visible trailhead. He sat there for almost 5 minutes, reprimanding himself for being such a fool. With every mile that he had traveled from Joseph, the memories had come back with adrenaline-enforced clarity, and now he was mentally certain that he wanted to go no farther. But the inner compulsion to press on was irresistible. Even as he urged with himself, he buttoned up his coat and reached for his leather gloves. He stood and stared down the path, deciding to leave everything in the car and hike a mile or so down to the lake. At least that way he wouldn't have to lug anything back up the hill when he returned to leave, which he now expected would be in very short order. He was cold enough that his breath hung in the air around him, and it even felt as if it might snow. The pain that had been building in his stomach finally pushed him into panic. After only 5 steps, he stopped it and retched so strongly that it brought him to his knees. "Please help me," he groaned. He stood up on shaky legs and took another step away from the car. Then he stopped it and turned back. He opened the passenger door and reached in, rummaging around until he felt the small tin box. He peered the lid off and found what he was looking for, his favorite picture of Missy, which he removed along with the note. Replacing the lid, he left the box on the seat. He paused for a moment, looking at the glove box. Finally, he opened it and grabbed Willie's gun, checking to make sure it was loaded and the safety was on. Standing up, he closed the door, reached under his coat, and stuck the gun in his belt in the small of his back. He turned and faced the path once more, taking one last look at Mrs. Picture before sliding it into his shirt pocket alongside the note. If they found him that, at least they would know who had been on his mind. The trail was treacherous, the rocks icy and slippery. Every step took concentration as he descended into the thickening forest. It was eerily quiet. The only sounds he could hear were the crunch of his steps on the snow and the heaviness of his breathing. Max started feeling as if he was being watched, and once he even spun around quickly to see if anyone was there. As much as he wanted to turn and run back to the jeep, his feet seemed to have a will of their own, determined to continue down the path and deeper into the dimly lit and increasingly dense woods. Suddenly, something moved close by. Startled, he frozen silent and alert, with his heart pounding in his ears and his mouth suddenly dry. He slowly reached behind his back, sliding the pistol from his belt. Snapping off the safety, he peered intensely into the dark underbrush, trying to see or hear anything that might explain the noise and slow the rush of adrenaline. But whatever had moved had now stopped, was waiting for him just in case. He just stood motionless for a few minutes before he again began inching his way farther down the trail, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest seemed to close in around him, and he began to seriously wonder if he had taken the wrong path. Out of the corner of his eye, he again saw movement and instantly crouched down, peering between the low branches of a nearby tree. Something ghostly like a shadow slipped into a brush, or had he only imagined it? Again, he waited, not shifting a muscle. Was that God? He doubted. Maybe an animal? He couldn't remember if there were wolves up here, and deer or elk would make more noise. And then the thought he had been avoiding. What if it is something worse? What if I have been lured up here? But for what? Slowly rising from his hiding place, concealed drone, he took a step forward when suddenly the bush behind him seemed to explode. Mac whipped around, scared and ready to fight for his life, but before he could squeeze the trigger, he recognized the rear end of a badger scampering back up the trail. He slowly exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, lowered his gun, and shook his head. Mac the Courageous had been reduced to just another scared boy in the woods. Snapping the safety back on, he tucked the gun away. Someone could get hurt, he thought with a sigh of relief. Taking another deep breath and exhaling slowly, he calmed himself, determined that he was done being afraid. He continued down the path, trying to look more confident than he felt. He hoped he hadn't come all this way for nothing. If God was really meeting him here, he was more than ready to get a few things off his chest. Respectfully, of course. A few turns later, he stumbled out of the woods and into a clearing. At the far side and down the slope, he saw it, the shack. He stood staring, his stomach a ball of emotion and turmoil. On the surface, it seemed that nothing had changed other than the winter stripping of the deciduous trees and the white shirt of snow that blanketed the surroundings. The shack itself looked dead and empty, but as he stared, it seemed for a moment to transform into an evil face, twisted in some demonic grimace, looking straight back at him and daring him to approach. Ignoring the rising panic he was feeling, Mac walked with resolve down the last 100 yards and up onto the porch. The memories and horror of the last time he had stood at that door came flooding back, and he hesitated before pushing it open. "Hello," he called, not too loudly. Clearing his throat, he called again, this time louder. "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice echoed up the emptiness inside. Feeling bolder, he stepped confidently across the threshold and stopped. As his eyes adjusted in the dimness, he began to make out the details of the room by the afternoon light filtering in through the broken windows. Stepping into the main room, he recognized the old chairs and table. He couldn't help himself as his eyes were drawn to the one place he could not bear to look. Even after a few years, the faded blue stain and was still clearly visible in the wood near the fireplace, where they had found Mrs. Dress. "I'm so sorry, honey." Tears began to well up in his eyes, and finally his heart exploded like a flash flood, releasing his pent-up anger and letting it rush down the rocky crevice of his emotions. Turning his eyes heavenward, he began screaming his anguished questions. Why? Why did you let this happen? Why did you bring me here? Of all the places to meet you, why here? Wasn't it enough to kill my baby? Do you have to toy with me too? In a blind rage, Mac grabbed the nearest chair and flung it at the window. It smashed into pieces. He picked up one of the legs and began destroying everything he could. Groans and moans of despair and fury burst through his lips as he bit his wrath into the terrible place. I hate you. In a frenzy, he pounded out his rage until he was exhausted and spent. Despairing and defeated, Max slumped to the floor next to the bloodstained. He touched it carefully. That was all that was left of his Missy. As he lay next to the stain, his fingers tenderly traced the discolored edges, and he softly whispered, Richie, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you, I'm sorry I couldn't find you. Even in his exhaustion, the anger seethed, and he once again took aim at the indifferent God he imagined somewhere way beyond the roof of the shack. God, you couldn't even let us find her and bury her properly. Was that just too much to ask? As the mix of emotions ebbed and flowed, his anger giving way to pain, a fresh wave of sorrow began to mix with his confusion. So where are you? I thought you wanted to meet me here. Well, I am here, God, and you? You're nowhere to be found. You've never been around when I needed you. Not when I was a little boy, not when I was lost Missy. Not now. Some papa you are. He spat out the words. Max sat there in silence, the emptiness of the place invading his soul. His jumble of unanswered questions and full-blown accusation settled to the floor with him and then slowly drained into a pit of desolation. The great sadness tightened around him and he almost welcomed and the smothering sensation. This pain he knew, he was familiar with it, almost like a friend. Mac could feel the gun in the small of his back, an inviting cold pressed against his skin. He pulled it out, not sure what he was going to do. Oh, to stop caring, to stop feeling the pain, to never feel anything again. Suicide? At the moment, the option was almost attractive. It would be so easy, he thought. No more tears, no more pain. He could almost see a black chain opening up in the floor heap behind the gun. He was staring at a darkness, sucking any last vestige of hope from his heart. Killing himself would be one way to strike back at God, if God even existed. Closed, parted outside, and the sunbeam suddenly spilled into the room, piercing the center of his despair. But what about Nan? And what about Josh and Kate and Tyler and John? As much as he longed to stop the act in his heart, he knew he could not add to their hurt. Max sat in his emotionally spent stupor, weighing the options in the fear of the gun. A cold breeze brushed past his face, and part of him wanted to just lie down and freeze to death. He was so exhausted. He slumped back against the wall and rubbed his weary eyes. He let them fall closed as he mumbled, "I love you, Missy. I miss you so much." Soon he drifted without effort into a dead sleep. It was probably only minutes later that Mac woke with a jerk. Surprised that he had nodded up, he stood up quickly, stuffing the gun back into his waistband and his anger back into the deepest part of his soul. He started up for the door. "This is ridiculous. I'm such an idiot to think that I hoped God might actually care enough to send me a note." He looked up into the open rafters. "I'm done, God," he whispered. "I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying to find you in all of this." And with that he walked out the door, Mac determined that this was the last time he would go looking for God. If God wanted to him, God would have to come find him. He reached into his pocket and took out the note he had found in his mailbox and tore it up, letting the pieces slowly sift through his fingers to be carried up by the cold wind that had kicked up. A weary old man, he stepped off the porch and with heavy footsteps and a heavier heart started the hike back to the car.